Hello, hello, everybody. Welcome to GMAT Club and Manhattan Prep's presentation of your last 14 days. How are you going to hit your peak score on test day? That's what we're looking to explore. Now, full notice. Some of this stuff you're going to have to build the infrastructure for before the last 14 days. We're going to be touching on some of that, but we're specifically focused on what to do in those last 14 days to use all the infrastructure you have hopefully built in preparing for the GMAT. So stick around and let's talk about your last days. Dun, dun, dun. And indeed, you guys, anybody who would like to join the chat, please do comment. If you're watching on YouTube later, be in the chat now. Ask whatever questions you have, like, is it for CR? No, not specifically, but I'll mention CR because you asked. That's the power of the chat window. Get in on it, you guys. All right, this is all the stuff we're going to talk about with weird numbering. Error log, planning, and random practice tests. Big controversy over practice tests we will discuss. Tejas, you're in the right place. I'm so glad you're here to talk about it. The role of rest. Again, one of the most unheralded and underestimated keys to your success. Rest a lot. What you should do on the last day of studying and what you should do on test day. So we're going to take you all the way up to the day itself. Let's go. Starting with the most important piece leading up to a successful test, the error log. It seems unimportant when you first start studying. It becomes pretty important as you get into your late stages of studying. All right. And first off, I want to say up front, the error log thing, the thing we all call an error log, it's a total misnomer. You don't really want an error log. It doesn't really matter what your errors are. Your errors, recognizing them, pinpointing them is only the first stepping stone on your way to actually getting better at these problems. But it itself is not enough, okay? To demonstrate, here's what we're going to do, you guys. I've got this problem up. If you're watching on YouTube later, pause it, try this problem. If you're here right now, give this problem a try. I'll give you guys a great way, all right? So this is kind of an ideal problem to talk about because when you get up to the more difficult levels on the test, you're getting tested on multiple skills at the same time, right? This is, of course, an overlapping sets problem, the sort of problem you can set up with a table really effectively, with a Venn diagram a little bit less successfully, and with a like splitting tree, I don't know, formula, maybe. I love the table approach for this. There can be 9 pieces of information coming from this problem, and the table accounts for all 9 of them really well, all right? But it's also a percents problem. And the place people tend to struggle on this problem is indeed with the percents. Now, to those of you who answered in the chat, you didn't struggle at all. You did a great job. Well done, you. To those of you who might have struggled with this one, to those of you watching on YouTube who had some trouble with this one, or who came up with anything other than E, you've got an error log entry to make for this problem. And that's what we're going to talk about now, all right? Those of you who got E, you don't really have an error log entry to make. You kind of want to celebrate what went well in this problem, right? Remind yourself, oh yeah, I've known this. I've seen this before. I know how to handle this trap. And it is a very good trap. And just to diagram it a little bit, the place this problem gets people in is in the percentages, right? You've got 10% of something, you've got 20% of something, you've got 40% of something, and one that people always forget, you've got what percent of something in the end. And anytime you have percent of, you're going to have a phrase after it that defines the total for that percentage calculation. You're taking 10%. 10% means nothing on its own. You've got to take 10% of something to make it make sense. And one of the things the GMAT will famously do in such a problem, especially as they get to the higher and higher levels, is change up what you're taking a percentage of. And it can be done in subtle ways, right? So the first 10%, it's of GMAT test takers. The 20% seems to be of the same, but it's actually of a subgroup of GMAT test takers who take the test only once. And this is the part that usually makes the difference between picking especially D and E, and then 40% of GMAT test takers, and what percent of GMAT test takers. And notice it's really only the who that makes a difference here, right? 20% is of GMAT test takers who take the test only once, whereas 10%, 40%, and what percent are of GMAT test takers. And then you go straight into the verb. Take the exam more than once. Have a high score of less than 605. And that makes all the difference in this problem. A lot of people will take the 20% the exact same way they took the 10% and the 40% and the what percent. I will also say that it's in the what percent stage of a problem that they often slip their best traps in there. They change what they're asking a question about versus what they've given you throughout the problem. All right. So let's say you got through this problem, you got it right. Again, nothing to put in the error log, but if you got it wrong, there will be a temptation to say, all right, I did this problem. I misread. It should have been that I saw that 20% was of something else, but I didn't, right? That is your error. Sure enough, yeah, that's absolutely your error. You did misread, right? But just knowing that you misread in a problem doesn't give you anything to go on for how not to avoid it in the future, for when not to avoid it in the future, right? It's just kind of a thing that makes you feel bad about yourself, all right? An error log can't just be about errors. And to the extent that it is about errors, you got to be pretty precise with your errors, all right? What did you misread? In what circumstance did you misread? What was the exact nature of the misread? So that if you come back to that problem again later, you can remind yourself, yeah, this was the part. Let me study this part again. Let me get my takeaway again, all right? Because an error log is ultimately a tool for future study. It's a tool that informs what you're going to try to get better at, especially in the weeks leading up to the test, right? I've got a fake error there from some other problem, and I've got, of course, our top error there, the misreading. So don't just leave it at misread. Be a little specific about where you misread in your error log. But that still is not enough, and that's definitely not all you need to be focusing on as you review a problem, right? Your review of problems should take at least twice as long as going through the problem, if not significantly longer. You do your review untimed, all right? And that review can consist of many things. You could retry the problem untimed. If you were doing it time first, definitely give yourself some opportunity to retry it untimed, right? You can try to approach the problem in a different way. If you succeeded the first time, you might want to try it a different way. You might want to see, will a different way actually work better? Will it work worse? Either way, if you're trying it a different way, you're building up your flexibility in how you think about problems, and you're building up that secondary skill that you could have used to solve the problem, so that both skills are strong next time you see such a problem, right? As such, you do want to review all questions, whether you got them right or wrong. When you got them right, see if you can do them in another way. And at the end of the day, what you're really looking for when you review problems is not the error you made, right? That is indeed just a stepping stone to a takeaway, all right? You're trying to get a takeaway from the problem, not specifically how to do that exact problem again, because you're probably not going to see that exact problem on test day. In fact, I'll go so far as to say you're definitely not going to see that exact problem on test day. All right, so your takeaways can't be hyper-focused on the specifics of the problem. Focusing on the specific part you messed up is a stepping stone to your takeaway, but your takeaway needs to be a bit more generalized, all right? And there are lots of things you can consider in coming up with that takeaway, right? How was your process? Was your scratch work good? Was it bad? Were you confused from the outset? Should you have even done that problem if you were doing it in a timed setting? Or would that have been a good opportunity to guess, move on, right? Was that problem for you? I know that I only got 2 answers, both correct, in the chat window, right? But for anybody else who was here, who was trying with that problem, you had a couple of minutes and you might not have felt much better off after those couple of minutes than you felt at the beginning of the problem. And in that case, one of your takeaways has to be, all right, when I see a problem like this, I might consider skipping it. It might not be my jam. And that's particularly true in the last 14 days of studying, right? If you're seeing problems in the last 14 days where you're like, whoa, I don't know how to do that in under 2 minutes and under 3 minutes or whatever, that's a good one to add to your, on test day, I probably should skip this problem list. And ideally, there won't be too many of those problems in the last 14 days, but there will probably be some. And that's okay. That is very much how the GMAT is designed, right? It is designed to break you. It's designed to give you problems eventually that are too hard for you to do in the allotted time. And one of the senses you're trying to develop in these last 14 days is which problems are lost causes, which problems are my opportunities to buy back time as opposed to my opportunities to get a question right and move my score higher. Always remember, you guys, the harder the problem you get on the GMAT, the less it hurts your score to get it wrong, right? But the more it costs you time to get it right. And that's an opportunity. You can buy back bigger chunks of time from hard problems with less hit to your score than you would take from easier problems that they might sneak toward the end and really make you pay for if you've encountered timing issues through the section, right? So in these last 14 days, you're thinking about test day all the time. You're thinking about how you want it to go. And that's going to be particularly important in our last day before the test, step 5 of this presentation. We're going to come back to that, right? But it gets informed by your practicing now. One of your review stages is, should I have done this problem at all? And if I shouldn't have, why not? What is it about this problem that makes it something that I probably shouldn't touch? What are the key features that gave me trouble here, right? Because that's what's going to help you on test day to make that decision when you're under pressure in a split second and make it well. All right. Ultimately, what you want to know is if you could do that problem over again right away, what would you do differently? Or if you could go back in time, 5-10 minutes and tell the you of before one piece of advice that they could have used, not specifically about the problem, no, you're not giving the problem away, but one piece of advice kind of generalized that if they had it, they might have actually succeeded on that problem. What would that piece of advice be? All right, that's what you're looking for in a takeaway. And it can be about scratch work. It can be about how and how many times you read a problem. It can be about the specifics of the problem, percentages, for instance, right? Overlapping sets and things like that. But more and more, especially in these last 14 days, you're going to want to focus on process issues. Did you use the right process? Are there upgrades to make to your scratch work or to your overall reading and note-taking and such habits? Okay, because that's the stuff you have the most opportunity to get points from in the last 14 days. You're not trying to learn whole new topics from scratch in those last 14 days. You're not trying to get to a point at which you get every single hard problem right. You're trying to be a pragmatist about it. Which ones should I try? Which ones shouldn't I try? For those ones that I try, how am I going to make sure that I give my best performance on those ones? Okay, your takeaways are going to help with that. Now, again, a lot of this is about how to build up an error log so that you have it to use in these last 14 days, because we're going to talk majorly about how to use it. All right. But building up an error log is key, and it's something that a lot of people overlook early on in their studying. Now, I'm cognizant of the fact that some of you are in your last 14 days and you either have an error log or you don't. But even in these last 14 days, you can absolutely build an error log. And I'll show you a style of error log that can be really, really helpful in the last 14 days. Okay. Think of it not as an error log. I said that's a misnomer, but it's a review and redo log, right? You're trying to get takeaways, and you're trying to get takeaways so that they can inform what you're going to do in future practice. Some of it should be coming back to the problems that yielded the takeaways to begin with and coming back to them in a very particular way, which I'll describe. Some of it is going to be about doing similar problems to the problem that yielded the takeaway, but not the same problem, so that you can extend the takeaway into slightly different spheres, right? Note your type of error, note what you want to do differently, and note whether it's even going to be important enough to try to attempt, to try to perfect for test day, all right? Here's an example of a much more complete review log, all right? It's got to be actionable. You start with your error. You want to know what that error is, but you're trying to get to that advice you'd give to the you of 10 minutes ago that would help the you of 10 minutes ago avoid the error. And even leaving it there is not enough, because if you don't point out when this advice is going to be useful, and if you don't generalize somewhat, it's never going to be actionable. The you of 10 minutes from now is not going to be able to use it, right? it's not going to be actionable if it doesn't have a specific look, a specific feature, a specific question type, a specific trigger for when it's going to be used, right? There's no way for your brain to just like say, oh, I'm going to use this thing here without knowing what the here should look like, right? And there's no way that you're going to be able to organize future practice around problems that you have had errors on if you don't think about when this takeaway applies. You can put a date for your redo, and really importantly, put in the last column or wherever you want it, other problems on which this takeaway applies. Maybe some of those are problems you come across on practice tests or in other practice sets you do. Some of them though should be, I've sought out such problems and I have tried to use this takeaway in those problems and I've seen, yeah, it totally applies here. You want to kind of have a log of the problems in which you've used the takeaways. It has two purposes, right? It helps you to tie those takeaways to other problems more explicitly, not just in the back of your mind, but in a way that you can see in black and white on your screen, on your notebook, whatever it is. But it also helps you to make those takeaways more robust, right? It's extending it to other problems helps you to make those takeaways like much more generalized, much more usable on test day, so that when you do see something completely new, you're like, yeah, but it's not completely new. I remember that feature. Moreover, the more kind of problems you have listed for any given takeaway that you have in your error log, the more you know, hey, this actually might be an important thing, right? This is something that I've seen come up in lots of problems. So I'd better focus on this takeaway. If you have a takeaway and you only have one problem listed by it, you couldn't find similar problems, you didn't come across similar problems, in those last 14 days, this is probably not the takeaway you really want to focus on. You want to focus on the takeaway that's come up time and time again. All right. And that's particularly important for follow-up practice. Follow-up practice in the last 14 days is kind of everything. You do want to extend to other problems. And the question always comes up, but how do I do that? How do I find other problems to which I can extend these learnings, right? Two really good ways, and there are more ways besides, right? Official guide. If you have an ebook copy, especially of the official guide, can be a great way to go and find follow-up problems. And I assume a lot of you do. If you're studying for this test, official guide is definitely a thing, right? But GMAT Club is another fantastic resource for finding problems on which you can extend your takeaways, right? So if you're using the official guide, if you have it as an ebook, it has a handy dandy search function. And you can say, okay, I saw that this was how I read a percent of problem. I see that like they'll change the total on me after the word of partway through the problem. Let me see if I can find a couple other problems with that feature in the official guide. You don't even necessarily need to do those problems. Finding them, recognizing that they're doing that, reading for it. I mean, this was fundamentally a reading error. And so reading, teaching yourself to read those problems in the right way by looking at other examples and by making your eyes maybe pause after the word of, maybe double read what comes after of, maybe go into those problems expecting that sort of trick so that you train your brain, hey, you see problems like this, you should be on edge because you've been expecting these sorts of shenanigans. All of that is really, really useful. The recognition part and the finding of the problems is doing at least half the work in giving you what you need from that takeaway on that problem, right? In GMAT Club, also incredibly easy. You go to the forums, you go to the quant forum, and you can search, of course, by difficulty and by topic. And if you're a registered user, by source and other things as well. This would be a percent and interest problem. You filter by that topic, you apply, and boom, a whole list of percent and interest problems. Not all of them will have this feature. Absolutely. Some of them will be percent change problems rather than percent of problems. Some of them will be percent of problems that don't have that feature. And all of that is okay, because I'm looking through those problems and sifting through them and saying, nah, this one takeaway doesn't apply to. This one, yeah, it totally applies to. You're sharpening that takeaway even more, right? You need to see some examples of problems to which the takeaway doesn't apply as well, so that your brain can start separating it into, okay, I know kind of specifically what it is in a problem that requires this takeaway. And you want to get it to a point at which it's almost habit. It's just natural for you to, when a problem like that comes up, see it that way, read it that way, be ready for it, or not be ready for it and be ready for other traps, because yeah, it's a percent problem, but it's a percent change problem. And, you know, I found that there the trap is similar, but somewhat different, that sort of thing. All right. Now, I mentioned before, there is more than one way to make a review log. And if you haven't been doing a review log up until your final days, it can be better to do more of a skills log, right? What skills do you need to get through these problems? What skills do you want to be sure that you're using on test day? And there's a lot of skills out there, but these are all fairly generalized. These are the kinds of skills that maybe apply to lots of different kinds of problems, right? Smart numbers, making up your own numbers to go through a problem, or this kind of archetypical equation, x times y equals z, price times quantity equals total, or average times number of things equals sum, or rate times time equals distance, or something like that. Maybe you get that from a problem and you've seen that that comes up in many problems. And maybe your takeaway from those is, hey, I need to set those up algebraically all the time. It's going to be great. Or maybe your takeaway is, yeah, when I see a thing that's going to go that way, hourly wage times number of hours, let's say, I'd better work backwards on those problems because it seems like that works a lot and the equations always lead to quadratic systems of equations. Nobody wants that, right? A skills-based log can be really, really effective. Ultimately on test day, what you want to be sure of is that you're gonna use the right skills to approach problems, right? It's the skills that you use kind of early on in a problem when you're planning your way through it. How am I going to go about it, right? Am I going to use algebra? Am I going to use numbers and stuff like this? More on this later, but skills are really, really your focus. And so if you don't have an error log, you're running into these last 14 days, make a skills log. Point out like what skills are working for you in problems and what skills are not showing up for you in problems when you review a problem. Like you do a problem, maybe you got it right, but maybe you took 3.5 minutes. And so you're reviewing it by redoing it and you're trying it another way. Maybe you tried it numerically first and now you're going to be trying it algebraically, right? Or vice versa. And you find that this second way is actually much faster than the first, right? Whatever it may be. Well, one of your takeaways from that is, I see a problem like this. My natural way is to do it this way, but I found that this way works better. I wonder why that way works better. And I wonder if I can get that skill to be my kind of primary approach to these problems before test day. That's only going to happen if you're really focused on those skills themselves and focused on using them as primary approaches to problems, right? And so it can be a little bit harder to find problems that like follow up on these skills, right? It can be, you can't really search the official guide for smart numbers, right? You can't even really search GMAT forums for smart number opportunities or problems like that. So though I think there's some lists in there that can really help with that, but you also don't necessarily want to, because with skills-based takeaways, one of the real challenges is figuring out when you can use them. All you really want to do at first is shift your mindset to, okay, I want to find some problems in which I can use smart numbers. And yeah, it would help to get some guidance on when that can be done, what kinds of problems that can be done in. So you've got kind of a short list of places to look. But even just seeking out problems, turning to a random page of the official guide or searching kind of a random topic in gmatclub, and then seeing on which problems on that page, in which problems in those search results you can use smart numbers, is great because you're doing that separation thing, that sifting thing. You're figuring out not here, yes here, not here. And that helps your brain to carve a very, very specific model of, okay, this is the kind of problem. These are the kinds of problems in which smart numbers are going to be really, really good for me. All right. So skills-based takeaways, hugely important. You can add one alongside any error or review log you've been doing, because again, it is particularly important in the lead up to test day to be thinking more about skills. You can start one in the last however many days and actually get some good out of it. Okay. It doesn't have to be topic based. Now, what do you do? What do you do with the error log, right? So we've already talked about seeking out similar problems to use your takeaways on. Hugely important. That's important kind of throughout your studying, but it becomes more and more important as you leave the knowledge acquisition phase of your studying, that early part where you're just like, how do I add fractions again and stuff like that, and enter into the practice-based phase of your studying toward the end, right? But there are ways to supercharge how you use your error log, right? Planning practice is one of those ways. Random practice is kind of a necessary way to do it, but planning practice is what I really, really want to talk about. So in these last 2 weeks, don't try to learn new topics. That's not the goal. Don't take more than 2 practice tests, even if you are committed to random practice. A little bit more on this later. Who should be doing practice tests? Who shouldn't, right? Don't do more than 2 hours a day of practice problems. Certainly not in the last week before your test. If you want to push it up until then, fine. If you've booked time off work in the week before your test, you could maybe push it to about 3 or 4 days before your test. But if you keep rocking 4 hours of studying a day before your test, you will be fatigued. There will be burnout. Burnout, as we'll soon see, is real. What you do want to do is practice takeaways, right? And certainly those focused on minimizing careless mistakes, but also those in which you have an opportunity, or from which you have an opportunity to improve your timing, to improve the way that you approach problems, right? You definitely want to go over old stuff. You want to go over your review log, and in a very specific way, to make sure that your takeaways from those problems you've seen, they're not just like things you wrote down once a long time ago and never really looked at again. Now, I'm an advocate for having a review day every week of your studying, all right? Or at least like after the first 3 or 4 weeks, instituting a review day every week, so that all that stuff that you've done a few weeks ago that you've maybe moved on from because you're trying to learn new things and stuff, you explicitly bring back and use, right? The more you dredge stuff up in your mind and use it, the more you keep it on top of mind, and the more likely you are to be able to use it on test day, which of course is always the goal, all right? As such, especially in the lead up to the test, you want to start reviewing all your takeaways, and particularly those for which you have like multiple problems, multiple examples, errors you've run into multiple times, etc., right? And you want to practice planning, all right? In the last few days before your test, it becomes more and more beneficial, more and more important, drawing yourself down from doing a bunch of problems, killing yourself with problems, and going into just focusing on the planning stage. All right. What is planning? Planning basically goes like this. All right. You can do it on top of specific sets of problems. You can do it on random sets of problems, right? But basically, it involves looking at a problem and just thinking. Don't write anything down. You're not trying to do the problem. You're not trying to get an answer to the problem. You are just thinking. All right. Should you do the problem or shouldn't you? How are you going to do the problem if you're going to do the problem? Do you have an algebraic approach? Do you have a numerical approach? Do you have a pure logic approach? Which one would be best and why? And could you get to an educated guess based on, again, just looking at the problem and thinking about it? Now, you don't have to do this timed. Planning practice, the goal is not to be timed in your planning practice. The goal is to improve your decision-making process when you first see a problem. And the two decisions you really have to make are, should I approach this problem at all? Which approach should I use for the problem? And the better that first decision gets, the better a section manager you become, right? The better you do with managing your time for the whole section, and so optimizing your score on the test. The better you get at the second thing, that is choosing which approach to use, again, the better you get at section management, but on a micro level. It means for any given problem, you're upping your probability of getting through it in an efficient way, right? And that, of course, overall increases the number of problems you're going to be able to really try on and do successfully on the test, and so increases your score without the typical cost, which is spending 3-4 minutes on problems and running yourself out of time before the section is over. All right. One more time, you guys, if there are questions, if you have questions about your specific situation, put them in the chat window. If you're watching this on YouTube later, put them in the comments. All right. We use those to decide what should we do in future. Planning practice doesn't feel like you're doing problems. It feels like you're just looking at problems, and you can't be getting any good out of it if you're not like doing the problems, writing stuff down, getting it wrong or right. But you guys, planning practice is so important for your success, okay? Thinking through how an approach might go all the way till you get an educated guess is amazingly beneficial to your success, all right? And that's because it does some things with your brain, right? It's learning science backs this, and we're going to talk about it in a little bit. Planning practice basically enables you to retrieve takeaways, extend takeaways without specifically just looking at the problem that yielded them, and that forges new neural pathways in your brain, essentially. That's the preview of it. Let's talk a little bit about the role of practice tests in this and random timed practice. So random timed practice and practice tests are kind of one and the same. You're doing random timed practice to kind of simulate the conditions of practice tests, but in a more micro way, right? You're doing practice tests to, of course, simulate the conditions of the real test and all the complications thereof, the length of it, the time management, and so on. In a perfect world, by the time you hit your last 14 days, you will have already hit your target score a couple of times on a practice test, right? If you've done that going into your last 14 days, you're in a great position. You don't need to take a practice test in those last 14 days, and usually it's not beneficial. You can kind of only freak yourself out if you take a practice test in those last 14 days, with maybe one caveat, all right? If your time management was on point in your last 2 or more practice tests, if you're like, no, I know my time management strategy, I'm finishing the sections, maybe, you're leaving yourself the few minutes you want to leave yourself to go back to problems and double check them or retry some of the ones that you took guesses on along the way, no need to take a practice test in those last 2 weeks. Conversely, you might need to. All right. Don't take a practice test in the last 2 weeks if you're just anxious about the real test, because it's a gamble, right? If you take that practice test and it doesn't go well, now you're going to triple your anxiety for the real test, right? And then you might just want to take more practice tests, and then you're likely to burn out for the real test, all right? So if you're just feeling anxious about the test, that's normal. And there are other ways to handle your anxiety. More on that in a bit. Practice tests are always a gamble as a way to manage your anxiety. Now, some people, the way their anxiety goes really benefits from taking practice tests because it demystifies it. You're kind of in the swing of it. You got the cadence of it going into the real test, and you do feel a bit better. But even for those people, the results always affect confidence, right? And if those results aren't going as well as you would want, because there's some natural variations from test to test, because you start getting more nervous about how the results are going to be before your practice tests, then they've done you a disservice, right? However, there are definitely some people who might want to take a test in the last 2 weeks, right? For instance, if you haven't taken a lot of practice tests, and very connected to that, you haven't found what feels like your ideal section order, right? Because you can take the GMAT in any number of variations. And this is leaving breaks aside. You can do verbal first, verbal last, verbal in the middle. You can break up quant and data insights with verbal right, break up quant and data insights with the break. You can kind of do it a lot of ways. Some people find that they get their best results by starting on a strong section first and sandwiching their weak section in between their 2 somewhat stronger sections. Some people want to save their weak section for last. Some people very much want to get their weak section out of the way first. And results vary by person, right? It's different strokes for different folks. That's totally okay. But you got to try it different ways to know for sure which kind of folks you are, right? You've got to see yourself, feel yourself doing the test in different ways. And if you've only taken 2 practice tests along the way, or just not very many, if you've always done your practice tests in the same order, you might be leaving points on the table. It might be that a section order that you wouldn't have expected to benefit you is going to benefit you. Or you might find that a different section order definitely feels worse, and that can reinforce your confidence in the section order you'd chosen up until that point. Both are beneficial. All right. I'm seeing questions in the chat window. They are great questions. All right. And I'm actually going to address both of them here in due time. Thank you for those. Keep them coming. If in these last 14 days, you've never really completed a section, or your weak section, let's say, on time, maybe it's your quant section, maybe it is your verbal section, you've never completed it on time. And that's because you always think, okay, I'm going to handle my time this way, or I'm going to check in on time at these junctures, every 5 questions in quant, good time to check in on where you're at time-wise. You could say 8 questions or so in verbal. 6 questions can be actually a really good breakdown in verbal. You're going to check in on where you're at time-wise, right? But every time you've gone to a practice test, you've not managed to do that, all right? Partly, you can do that through timed random sets, right? Do a verbal set of 6 or 12 questions. Make sure that in a set of 6, you have a reading comprehension passage and a few critical reasonings, or in a set of 12, 2 reading comprehension passages and the rest critical reasonings. And make sure that you're keeping to the time guidelines you want. Random practice sets are kind of your training wheels on using time management strategies on a practice test. Using them on your practice test is in turn training wheels to using them on the real test, right? But if you've never in a practice test setting, therefore, used the ideal time management strategy, the one you have in mind that you know will work, but it's just like the wheels come off every time you've been on a practice test so far, you should definitely be taking a practice test in these last 2 weeks, maybe two, to give yourself an opportunity to use those time management strategies and actually hit your goals. Because if you cannot do it on a practice test, if you have not done it on the practice test, you will not do it on the real test. On the real test, everything in you is going to want to play things more conservatively, to make sure you got things right, to double check things, to use approaches that you were maybe using toward the beginning of your practice because they feel comfortable, they feel tried and true, to like, because you're trying to get everything right, not worry so much about time up front and just hope that it'll all work out. You know, that kind of magic thinking that doesn't really work out on test day. If you're not doing the hard things on practice tests in terms of time management, in terms of deciding, yeah, I need to leave this problem behind or whatever, I need to make sure I'm hitting this time benchmark and that I've hit this time benchmark. I need to make sure that when I don't hit my time benchmarks, I'm doing this in the next 6 questions or 5 questions or whatever. Skipping. Then take a practice test, and take a practice test on which your goal is very explicitly to use that time strategy that you know in your head should work, that you've just never managed to put into practice, right? Do it on 2 practice tests. But under no circumstances should you take a practice test within 3 days of your real exam. Like, at that point, there's not enough time to integrate whatever lessons you were going to get from that practice test anyway. Again, if your practice test at that point doesn't go so well score-wise, you're not going to feel like 3 days is enough to like address all those issues usually or anything like that. Even if you're taking practice tests in these last 14 days, your cutoff is 3 days before your exam. At that point, you're just hoping for the best on your exam, and you're doing more and more planning practice leading up to it. All right. Oops, not this slide. Ignore. Let's pivot from there into the role of rest. All right. Because burnout is real. Burnout is real, and burnout is real especially in the last 14 days before your exam, because it's at that point in your study process that you've been studying the longest cumulative time, right? Like that's the longest you've been studying by definition of how time works, right? And so that's when you're most likely to be burned out, especially if anxiety is gnawing at you from the other side, because that kind of eats into your mental bandwidth as well. And all of it kind of contributes to this feeling like, this is so much, or like, so tired of this, I've been doing this forever. If you are, and I know a lot of you will be like this, the kind of person is like, yeah, I've been foregoing all my social outings for like months as I've like taken this test really seriously. Really good chance your relationship with the GMAT is becoming toxic in these last 14 days. And what that really means for you, aside along with the like exhaustion of just doing problem after problem and seeing all these things together, is your mind's not going to be in its peak state to do well on the test. You want your mind to be sharp and engaged with this stuff on the test. And once you get to the burnout stage, what your mind's really doing is kind of like pushing against it, right? And you can almost feel it that way, like pushing against new stuff, pushing against the problems. And you start to like, the temptation is to say, I'm just going to power through. Like, it's the last 14 days, I got to do this. You know, just 14 more days, just 13 more days, just 12 more days. I can do this. I can do it a little bit longer. But you're not doing yourself any actual favors. You are probably doing yourself a huge disservice, right? Because test day requires you to have like peak mental bandwidth, right? It requires you to have the most resources available for your mind to make good decisions, to solve the problems without making mistakes, to dot your I's and cross your T's, but still to be efficient, to recall things that you've seen in takeaways and that you've been working on, but that aren't your natural way of doing things. All of that takes a bit of extra bandwidth on test day versus what it even takes on practice tests. And so if you're running yourself into the ground, studying extra hard in these 14 days leading up, and you've, of course, been doing the studying for weeks or for months leading up to that, you're basically guaranteeing that you will not have that clean, sharp, efficient mental state on test day. The more downtime in the lead up to the test is actually what you need, right? Rest is essential for your brain to actually learn and integrate things. You should be resting throughout your study process. You should have at least one non-study day a week, maybe 2. and they should be deliberate. They shouldn't just be like, oh, I was going to study today, but I just couldn't, or something like that, because that's going to reinforce for your mind, yeah, you're burned out and you deserve a real rest. It's also not going to give your brain the benefits of the rest that you're taking, right? Intentional and deliberate rest days help your brain to make the most of that downtime, because your brain doesn't have any downtime, right? You guys know this. Even when you're sleeping, your brain doesn't have downtime. Your brain's always doing things, right? It's just a question about whether you're pushing it to do those things, you're directing those things, or it's directing those things itself. And you need a balance between those two, because when your brain directs things itself, what it usually does is polish things, pieces of knowledge off, file them away for better retrieval, and so on, right? And if you're not giving yourself that rest and that downtime, it never gets to file those things away. And so you can kind of picture this, right? Like imagine an office in which you got this one worker trying to put everything nicely filed away, but you just keep piling more and more papers on this worker's desk, more and more papers, more and more papers. And this worker's trying so hard to file everything away. It starts feeling like it's never going to be able to file everything away, right? It starts to get a bit discouraged, a bit overworked, a bit, it ends up being a bit of a Sisyphean task. How are you ever going to find the papers you need later on? How can you then go to that worker and say, hey, worker, find me that paper I gave you 2 weeks ago about the percent problem. You got that, right? No, the worker's going to like frantically search through stacks of paper because maybe it's there, or maybe trying to rack itself because its brain 2 weeks ago, did we file that percent problem before that or after that? It's going to be impossible, right? It's in the downtime. It's when you're not piling more papers on your brain's desk that your brain has the freedom to put everything nicely in its place, right? And not everything's going to end up there. It's not a perfect worker. Let's be honest. Your brain's always got a million things going on in it, but it gives it its best chance. And when it plans for those down days, it can plan a strategy. It's like it's anticipating that time. It's ready to go. All right. So when you sleep, your brain is filing things away. It makes the pieces of knowledge ready to go. All right. And there again is that temptation to power through in the last 2 weeks, feeling like every single day is an opportunity to get better. What you need to know in your hearts, in your brains, is that rest days are part of that opportunity to make sure that you're getting better for test day. All right. They are not a cop out. They are not weak. They are not, just like a break from your studying for the sake of a break, but the studying would have been better. No, they make all the studying that happens around them much better. They are a force multiplier. All right. Rest days are so important in the last 2 weeks. And that is a huge part of the reason that you want to taper off in the days leading up to the test. Okay. You don't take any non-study days, everything's going to blur together. Everything's going to be ugly, ugly piles on desks, you guys. Not for you. Not for you. So what happens in these last days of studying? What can really, really help you here? And I promise I'm going to answer your questions because I do very much love them. You should be reviewing your takeaways in the last few days before you're studying. Again, this is your last chance for a practice exam if your test is on, let's just say, the 14th on this fake calendar, right? Review your takeaways in the last day of studying. Even in the last couple of days before studying, you should be shifting to almost entirely planning practice, right? And planning practice, I mentioned this before, planning practice works best in these last couple of days as retrieval practice, okay? What does that mean? One of the ways you can do retrieval practice using your review log is go to those questions that you've listed in the last column that use certain takeaways. Don't remind yourself of what those takeaways were right away. Go to those questions, look at one of them, look at a couple of them, and see if you can come up with what the takeaway was or what the thing to watch out for was, right? Pushing your brain to kind of retrieve those takeaways with just a little bit of prompting, awesome. Or cover up all the columns in your takeaways except maybe the error that happened or just your takeaway column, what your takeaway is. And try to picture, oh yeah, what kind of problems can I use that takeaway in again? Try to like conjure up the problems you have used it in again, right? These mental exercises you can do become the thing in the last couple of days before test day. And in the very last day before test day, one of the mental exercises you want to make sure that you employ is visualization. You want to visualize how you want the test to go, what you're going to do in the case that this kind of problem shows up, this timing issue shows up, right? When you're going to be skipping problems, what those are going to look like. When you're going to be using certain skills from your skill log, what those problems are going to look like. All of this is retrieval practice, essentially. All of this is like pre-retrieval practice. You're using just your mind to dredge up, this is when I'm going to do this. This is when I'm going to do that. Because at the end of the day, you're not going to, on test day, have your error log in front of you as you do the test. And you're not going to have your error log like visually memorized in all likelihood so that you can like scroll through it in your mind and access all the takeaways that way. It's got to be just about you and what the test shows you, right? So prompting yourself with just problems, thinking about how you do them, trying to recall what your takeaway is, what to be careful for traps-wise, what you're going to do in your scratch work on such problems, etc. Hugely important in these last couple of days before the test, and especially in the last day. Visualizing the test, hugely important in the last day. Sleeping well, right? You don't want to stay up till like 2 a.m. the night before an 8 a.m. test studying, unless that's what you've done your whole life, stay up till 2 a.m. Then maybe, but remember, the sleep is really, really good for your brain. It's really, really good for your retention of your takeaways, for your readiness to handle the test, right? Sleep in the last 2 weeks is important. Sleep in the last few days is ultra important, right? Eating well. Eat, not a bunch of junk. Don't overeat. Don't significantly undereat. Though there is some evidence that undereating can sharpen your mind for that test. Just don't do it. Just eat well, eat as normal, make yourself comfortable, happy, and go through a lot of things with your mind alone or with little hints and little prompts from your error log, one column at a time, right? You can review your error log, your takeaway log for sure. Like it's good to have a kind of general review of it, right? But that's going to be a lot of stuff. And that's, again, more to just kind of like put all those things vaguely to the top of your mind. But you're going to get the most out of your error takeaway log if you do that kind of like limited prompting, all right? And most, even more perhaps, if you're just doing it purely from your mind. If you, before you go to the takeaways, can remind yourself, what are some of the takeaways I want to be using? Then go to your takeaway log and see, okay, which ones did I get? Which ones did I forget about? For those ones you forgot about, try to remember what problems you've used them in. Go to some of those problems and remind yourself how they can be used, right? But more and more, you're shifting it to brain only. It is you and your brain, ultimately, and they're on test day, you guys. And that's what you got to make the deal with. All right. And then finally on test day, what do you want to do? What do you not want to do? Eat a good breakfast. Wake up at ideally a normal time, unless you've got a very early test. Wake up with enough time to eat a good breakfast and to show up early for your exam. Now, you don't have to show up early. Rules say you can show up to 15 minutes late, and they're going to be cool with it. But show up early, because if you show up late, you're just going to be on edge and nervous because of that whole experience, right? To show up early, you should kind of know where the test center is, or you should have the day before like logged in, made sure you've done the readiness test if you're taking the exam online, downloaded the latest version of the browser, because let me tell you, I downloaded the browser on test day once. It was not a great experience. It was a 200 megabyte file, but it took like 20 minutes to download. And so I went from being early for my test to being about 5 minutes late for my test. It wasn't my best look, but it also on that particular day wasn't my worst look either. Do a couple of problems just before the test. Some people really find that they benefit from this because, and we've all kind of been here, those of us who've taken the real test. I've been here. I took a test in like 2019. I've been teaching the test for like 15 years at that point. I took a test, showed up for it, did verbal first, which I don't usually do, just for a lark. Saw a sentence correction question, which I used to be very good at. I am very good at, I guess. And my mind went totally blank. Not because of lack of preparation, not because I was nervous about the test, just my mind went blank, right? Did not know what to do. And I think that's a really, really common experience. From what I've heard from students over the years, it's a really common experience to get to the real test, see that first problem and just be like, uh-oh, like your mind goes into panic mode, deer in the headlights, as they say. You do a couple of warm-up problems before that, like maybe on your phone at the test center, maybe before you go into the room and log on for your online test, just a couple of problems, 2-3 problems, right? Do them in your mind. You don't have to like write them down. Don't worry about getting them right or wrong. Don't even check whether you got them right or wrong. Do a couple of problems before the test, and you're priming yourself for what's coming your way. That means that the first couple of problems you see on the test are not the first problems you're seeing for the day, not your brain's first chance to engage with those problems. And if those couple of problems you do in your head don't seem to go well, don't let that freak you out. Just be glad that that happened on those couple of problems and not the first couple of problems on your actual test, which is exactly when they would have happened, when they would have occurred if you hadn't done the warm-up problems. All right, don't do more than a couple, but do a couple. And whatever you've been doing to kind of stare down your anxiety, whatever you found works for any anxiety you have in normal life. Some people use affirmations and mantras. Some people use some meditation, right? 10 minutes of meditation. Some people have this mindful movement thing, and there are tons of things. Some people play music to recenter themselves. Some people have breathing exercises, visualization exercises, whatever it is that works for your anxiety. Early on test day is the day to do those things. And again, just before your test, if you're waiting in the lobby, or if you're, what often happens with the online test, if you're kind of waiting between like logging in and getting your proctor to show up and do the security check, or waiting between having done the security check and getting your other proctor to show up and actually start the exam, that's a good time to be using your anti-anxiety skills. And there are many such skills. All right. Don't overdo it on the day of the test. Don't drink too much coffee if you never would. Don't engage in totally random and distracting activities. All right. Yeah. Man, okay, good to know, Chirag. So this is your day of the test. Basically, just do everything you can to have a good morning. If your test is in the afternoon, go about your day kind of as normal. But again, be doing the visualizations and be doing the anti-anxiety things throughout the day. Because otherwise, if you're taking it in the afternoon, that just gives anxiety more time to build up unless you're kind of actively combating it through the day. And I've definitely heard that from people who do their tests a bit later. Okay. So I'm going to address some of your questions now, you guys, because I've taken us through those 14 days, but I haven't taken Chirag through the last 14 days, or Vignesh Deva. So by looking at quant problems, it increases anxiety if there's no way to know how the problem unfolds unless proceeded into a step 2 or 3. Absolutely right. So how to handle those as it affects your timing, right? To get to a step 2 or step 3. Ideally, what happens is, in your planning practice, the more you do it, this is why going toward an educated guess is actually really important. The more you do it, the more you want to push into the step 2 or step 3. In a perfect world, with enough planning practice, you can get through the easier and medium questions without having to write much down at all or anything, because the thoughts alone will carry you there. In the harder problems, you will often get to maybe step 2, maybe step 3, and then, per your point, you either have to like write it down to see what the next step is going to be, or you write it down and you still don't know the next step and you have to leave the problem. And so what I'd recommend doing for that is changing kind of how you see the role of scratch work, right? Scratch work in these cases is for like step 2 or step 3. You've done some thinking up front, you've gotten to step 2 or step 3, and you're trying to now offload what you're thinking to the scratch paper so that you free up mental bandwidth and kind of visually cue yourself to see what the next step may be. But you're not always going to be successful on those problems. Some of them, you're only going to get to step 2 and step 3, as mentioned, and you'll never be able to get through the problem. And so what you're trying to do, and this is why it's important to do this kind of planning practice and stuff, not just in the couple of days leading up to the test, but in the 14 days leading up to the test. Honestly, you can do it throughout your studying, but, ramp it up in the 14 days leading up to your test, is so that you can see, okay, when is it like odds are a bad bet to get 2 or 3 steps in my head and then try to see it through? And when is it a good bet? What kind of problems am I rewarded for it in? What kind of problems am I not rewarded for it in? And that's not going to tell you exactly what you should do on test day, but it's at least going to give you a decent starting point for making that decision, right? You're not going to be able or be wanting to do every such problem on test day. Some of them should be skips. And the faster you can get to those 2 or 3 steps in, right? And it's always faster to think than it is to write a bunch down. The sooner you get to that decision point and the sooner you can really make a call on the question. And yeah, that might take you 30 seconds, 40 seconds, even up to a minute. But if you still make the right decision a minute in to not do a problem or to press forward, you're fine. If you decide not to do the problem, you're still buying back time. Maybe not as much time as you could have done, but you're still buying back time. And you're probably buying back more time than you realize, because, if you guess a minute in, it's temptation to say like, okay, I've only saved myself a minute because I only had 2 minutes per problem. But it might well be that if you tried to see that problem through, it would have taken 3 minutes or 4 minutes. And so you've really bought yourself back 2 or 3 minutes worth of time you otherwise would have spent for that minute investment. Yeah, it's not totally perfect. It's not ideal, but it's pretty optimized, right? Like it is very pragmatic, right? Chirag asks what to do in verbal to improve your score when you have 14 days left, of course. And I know that like critical reasoning from your other questions, Chirag, has very much been on your mind. And you guys, if you have other questions, bring them in now because we're running down on time. We are getting to test day, so to speak. What do you do with critical reasoning? What do you do with verbal? With verbal, what you're really trying to do, the kind of like the skill you're trying to build in verbal is the skill of talking yourself out of picking wrong answers, knowing what makes those wrong answers wrong. And so talking yourself out of picking them and talking yourself into picking right answers, knowing for critical reasoning in particular, where those right answers connect in the arguments, how they slot into the arguments, how do you have to look at the correct answers? What kind of interpretation do you have to give to understand why they're the right answers? So for instance, for strengthen and weaken questions, right? The answers are anecdotal. They always start like, which of the following, if true, would most whatever, right? And the answers are like new kind of anecdotal facts. And they, on their surface, are going to contain new information that's not specifically mentioned in the problem, right? And so on the surface, the right answer can look like maybe it's a little bit out of scope or something, right? And that's because what they really want you to do with those ones is think either what assumption is that addressing? Or the way I tend to do it, what's the next consequence of this thing, right? So I'm thinking of an evaluate the argument question from the official guide about metal rings that were found in Mexico and whether the techniques to make those metal rings were learned from Ecuadorian artisans by their Mexican counterparts, right? And the right answer has to do with trade, right? It's an evaluate the argument question, and the right answer is whether there was trade between Ecuador and this region in Western Mexico around the time that the metal rings were, made or something like that, right? And on its surface, it's like, well, they're talking about trade. I really want to find out if these artisans in Mexico learned from their Ecuadorian counterparts, right? But you got to go to the next level from there. You got to think, okay, they're talking about trade. What effect might trade have on this situation? And of course, if there's trade going on of metal artifacts, then that could explain how the metal artifacts showed up in Mexico while bypassing this whole idea that the Mexican artisans learned how to make the metal rings from their Ecuadorian counterparts, right? And so it's in that answer choice's second level consequence that you really see the connection to the argument. And you've also almost got to like deliberately try to connect it to the conclusion or to the particulars of the argument, right? Wrong answers in questions like that will tend to do a couple of things, right? They'll address maybe the premises. You'll, in a strengthened question, have an answer that strengthens one of the premises instead of strengthening the conclusion by like plugging a gap leading up to the conclusion, right? Or you'll have a wrong answer that in strengthen and weaken famously, you'll have a wrong answer that says the opposite of what you want it to. And it'll seem tempting because it's so relevant to the argument being made, but it's just not going the way the conclusion needs it to go or something like that, right? And so you can identify certain trap answer types, and you should identify certain trap answer types because that's going to make it so that you've got a kind of an easy way into eliminating some of the answers. Oh yeah, clearly that's an opposite or whatever, easy elimination. But you're usually, even when you're like pretty prepared or close to prepared, going to get it narrowed down to 2 answer choices, right? And then the last 14 days, that's what you're really focused on. How to talk yourself into the right answer, how to talk yourself out of the wrong answer. So what you need to make your improvements in is in review. After you do a problem, right? Before you check your answer, make sure you've articulated, put into words, pinpointed exactly what's wrong with the wrong answers and how you think the right answer affects the argument, affects the conclusion specifically of the argument in the way that the question stem dictates, right? Then you check your answer. And let's say you got it down to C and D, you picked D and you check the answer and they say it's C. Before you go to the explanation, this is hugely important, you go back to C and D and you try to justify why they're going to say C is right. And you try to think of a reason why they're going to say D is wrong, right? And at the same time, you want to acknowledge, okay, this is why I thought C was wrong, but clearly it's not a deal breaker. This is why I thought D was right, but clearly that doesn't quite hit the metric, right? You want to engage with it that way before you look at the explanation. And your kind of skills log for that shouldn't really be a skills log. It should honestly be a traps log. Like, keep track of trap answers that you've fallen into. Try to give the wrong answers you've chosen names or characterize them in some way. And again, add to that list of problems in which you see that trap answer, because that way in the last 14 days in the lead up to the test, you can go and remind yourself, oh yeah, this trap answer got me, but it was wrong because of this. This trap answer got me, but it was wrong because of that, right? Not every wrong answer will fall into a classic trap category, but every wrong answer will be wrong for a reason. And the reason why it's wrong will be replicated in others. And if you find that you're often getting it narrowed down to 2, or you're like often picking the wrong answer after you've got it narrowed down to 2, you will also find that there are just a few things that those really tempting wrong answers are doing to you to make you pick them over the right answer, right? The more you articulate what those things are, the more examples of that thing you collect from different problems, the more kind of robust your studying is, and the more ready you're going to be for it on test day. It really is, at that point, a study of the answer choices and how they connect to the conclusion of the argument. Conk asks, how to look out for traps in each section. That's a really, really good question. One of the things I've found is that like traps definitely take on different looks in each section, right? So, and within quant and within data insights, and to some degree, I mean, even within verbal, traps take on different looks within different topics or within different question formats or things like that. So when you're looking at traps, and this is why it's so important to have kind of a trigger for your takeaways in your review log, when you're looking at traps, you want to think of them in like, does this apply to the whole topic I'm studying? Does this apply to this whole type of question, like data sufficiency or word problems or table questions that I'm studying? When do I need to look out for this trap? What's the nature of this trap? When do I need to look out for it, right? We just talked about it a little bit in a critical reasoning setting as well. Because if you don't have a trigger for those traps, if you like, let's say going back to that very first problem we did, the overlapping sets and percents problem, if you get into the reading trap on that problem, right? And you don't say, hey, it's in like percent problems that I have to pay attention for this, or it's in percent of problems, or it's after the of that this trap really lies. If you don't come up with like a new technique you want to use to make sure that you don't fall into that trap, you're going to fall into that trap again, right? Because you haven't trained your brain on a trigger for the new habit. You haven't taught it, this is when to look out for that trap. This is when to be on your guard. You haven't taught it a new habit to get into, and you haven't practiced that new habit because you don't know when to practice it, right? It's all haphazard. So a lot of traps are actually taken care of by the review log. Like the review log is very much for traps you encounter, scratch work upgrades you need to make, which often can come in response to traps you encounter, and just, you know, like issues in various topics that you run into, right? Anytime you feel like, oh, that was a careless mistake, no, there's a really good chance it's a trap, right? There's another video of me, another one of these GMAT Club videos in which I do a live data insights section. I miss like 5 questions, and basically all of them I miss because of misreads, right? But I also know, especially from that session, that misreading is a real danger in data insights. So since then, I've been like, okay, here's what I need to do to avoid those misreads. Read in small chunks, reread certain things like in table questions and MSR questions, especially in those like yes, no type questions, reread stuff, all right? Replace chunks of words with numbers that I've calculated or things I've pulled from the table, names I've pulled from the table and things like that, right? Traps are something you basically want to pay attention to all the time and you want to respond to proactively, right? But it's not just that you want to respond to those things proactively, you want to look out for those traps and the other problems. That's just like hugely what the takeaway and review log is all about, all right? So you need to be practicing for those all along the way. The goal is to change your habits around those traps, either in how you read the problem, how you understand the problem, how you approach the problem, or how you do your scratch work for the problem, right? Look for those kinds of takeaways, things you can specifically do to avoid those traps, and places where you expect those traps to come up where you can specifically employ those things that you're going to specifically do. All right. And should I try LSAT or OG questions before 14 days? Yeah, like when it comes to verbal, official questions are always best. LSAT questions definitely play like official questions. GRE, official logical reasoning questions, are also good and are honestly a bit better aligned with GMAT questions, because what happens with the LSAT is some of the harder questions on the LSAT dip more into formal logic than the ones on the GMAT. And if you've been studying for the GMAT that whole time, you'll probably be able to detect, oh, this is a bit weird for the GMAT. This feels a bit like technical or something, and you can ignore those ones. But the majority of LSAT's official questions are great to practice on. Nothing else, they have the same kinds of setups, the same question types by and large, and the same kinds of trap answers and stuff like that. And to some degree, the LSAT does it in a more complicated way. You almost over-prepare for critical reasoning on the GMAT by studying LSAT questions. Just again, don't worry too much about those formal logic questions. Then again, they might help a little bit with like data insights logic questions, so they may not go terribly amiss. They just won't help you much with the critical reasoning on the GMAT. All right. And finally, Conk asks, I have an error log just for unique questions I found and new concepts I learned. I don't log in every question I got wrong and do it again. Is this method okay of making an error? Is this method of making an error log okay? Yes, like you definitely, look, I don't really think you should. I know it said earlier in this presentation, do one for every question. I should have mentioned then, that's a bit overkill. Like you don't want this error or takeaway log to become so cumbersome that it basically hijacks all your studying. Unique questions, yes. But I think that like a good error log, you are putting in more entries kind of early on. And then ideally what happens is, I mean, ideally, in air quotes, you're finding that you like run into some of the same kind of errors a bit later on, right? And so you just get to add problems to those already existing errors rather than making new entries. I think that like putting an entry in for like a new unique problem is okay, but by that same token, if you only have unique problems in your error log, well, unique problems by their nature are unique and you're not necessarily as likely to see those again, right? And you do, as I mentioned before, get a little bit more buy-in on your takeaways that you've listed in your error log if you can see, yeah, this has come up in a lot of problems. So what I'd say is, yeah, you don't want to make an entry for every problem, and you don't want to make an entry for problems that you got right. You want to think through, why did I get this right? What did I see in this problem that helped me this? Just so you can like in your brain make explicit what happened, so you're more likely to use that same successful approach in the future, but you don't need to make an entry for that. You do want to just make sure that you're like, if you're making an error again, if you're seeing another problem in which a certain takeaway applies, you're just adding it to that list. And that's one of the more efficient ways to add to your error log without, having to like make an entry for every question. That said, like do add unique things to it. It's just, if you add a unique takeaway to your error log and you never see another problem in which it comes up, then in those days leading up to your test, that's maybe not an error you like super need to focus on. That, or it could be that your takeaways are too specific and problem focused and you need to generalize them a little bit more so they become a bit more, catch-all takeaways. And to know like the true nature of that takeaway that you've got from one problem, you do want to see if you can use it in another problem. So like, even if you are just making kind of a unique entry for each error, you've got to like follow up on those errors again by going through the official guide, by going to GMAT by going into whatever repository of practice problems you have and seeing if you can extend that takeaway to other problems. And so add to that list. Like that is essential regardless. All right. And how can I achieve consistency in verbal in the last 14 days? Because sometimes in sectional tests, I get 3 wrong and sometimes it goes up to 9 wrong in verbal. I mean, look, pay attention to what's different in your approach and your mindset on the 3 wrong versus 9 wrong days, right? Pay attention to like what's different in those cases in which you get 9 wrong about the questions themselves. Are you running into traps that you didn't run into on those sets when you got just 3 wrong, right? Are you more nervous? Are you changing your answers more? Like I would say, do a kind of like side-by-side comparison of those sets in terms of what your mental state was, how you were reading questions, what was happening in the lead up to doing those sets. Were you doing one, say, before work or in the middle of work versus one after? Were you doing one after you just did a long study set and one not? Were you doing one after eating a snack and one not? Because again, all of that stuff informs how you want to just kind of logistically run your life in the day or two, and certainly the day or two before the day of the test, right? Like you really want to do kind of a broad analysis on what's made 9 go wrong in this set and 3 go wrong in that set. Were they just harder problems in the set in which 9 went wrong? Were you choosing them from a different source, right? Any number of things like that. But ultimately, you still just want to get your takeaways from those 9 questions, right? Like, why were you tempted to pick the wrong one? What, again, piece of advice would you give to the you of 10 minutes ago to make sure that you chose right, okay? Write down the kind of trap answer you fell into and you're vulnerable to. Write down a takeaway about what made a right answer right if it was surprising to you, right? or what wasn't a deal breaker on an answer choice. When you picked D and you should have picked C and you eliminated C for some reason, it's probably important to write down, hey, don't eliminate an answer because of this. This is totally fine, right? The more you make it explicit, and kind of review log will help force you to make it explicit, the more you're going to work toward that consistency, all right? But it is also about, honestly, other circumstantial stuff, right? Just what kind of mental state was your brain in going into the set? Was it different? And if it was, what might have contributed to that better mental state that led to 3 wrong, rather than, or what might have contributed to that worse mental state that led to 9 wrong, all right? My friends, we are gonna end it there. You are in your last 14 days, so it probably doesn't bear saying, but for anybody watching this on YouTube who's maybe a little bit earlier in their study, start an error log early. Don't feel like you have to put every single problem into it. The errors you do track, you're gonna get better from, all right? And you don't want an error log to become inimical to your practice. You can take a free trial class with us at Manhattan Prep anytime you want. Get a free starter kit as well. And with that, I want to wish you guys, those of you in the last 14 days, the absolute best of luck. I hope I was able to answer some of your questions somewhat satisfactorily. I know it's a bit philosophical to be, thinking about problems and stuff like that, but it's in the thinking that you're really going to make your stand on test day. It's in upgrading your thought processes, your ability to avoid traps, whether in quant or in verbal or in data insights, that you're going to get the best performance out of yourself in test day, right? So do not underestimate the importance of thinking. Do not underestimate the importance of rest. Do not overdo it in the last 14 days. Prime yourself for test day by visualizing and planning things out, okay? It is, as Conk very correctly says, it is a psychological test, right? It is a test of so many skills other than just, can you solve a quadratic or can you weaken an argument? Take a broad view to the test, right? Thank you all for coming. Stay tuned for GMAT Club's upcoming sessions. Should be one in the next week or two, all about mindsets, how you're going to handle this exam. And there's going to be one on the admissions process and how you can up your chances getting an application successfully accepted. So be there or be square. Thank you all for coming this time, and I will see you around.